Hello and welcome to Catholic Kickstarter. My name is Stephen Fleming and you are very welcome to today's show. On today's show, we've got a great guest. It's Monsignor Tim from St. Chad's Cathedral, and so we'll meet him very shortly. See you in a bit. Hello, and you are very welcome to today's show. And we have Monsignor Tim Menezes with us today from St. Chad's Cathedral in Birmingham. So you're very welcome, Monsignor Tim. How are you doing?
Thank you, Stephen. Very well, thank you. Good to be with you.
No, it's great to have you today. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you've come to be on this show today, maybe.
Well, I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Birmingham, we should say in England for your international audience, and I've been a priest for 25 years. I'm a Birmingham boy. I grew up in Birmingham, went to school in Birmingham, went to Oscott College, St. Mary's College Seminary for 2 years, and then 6 years I was in formation for the priesthood at the English College in Rome. And since then, I've worked in parishes in Wolverhampton and Redditch and Coventry. And I've had some other spells doing other diocesan jobs like Archbishop Secretary and Vicar General. And now I'm the Dean of St. Chad's Cathedral, which is effectively the parish priest of the cathedral. And because it's the cathedral, some outreach to ecumenical and civic responsibilities within the Archdiocese.
Wow, quite a journey and quite a life full of experience there. So I encourage you at home, if you have a question for Monsignor Tim on any of the topics we're talking about, or even if you want to throw one out, and we'll see if Monsignor Tim can answer it. If you just put them into the comments, and we'll be able to bring those up. Also, let us know where you're from and where you're watching from today. Maybe put in your parish or what have you. It'd be really cool to see where people are watching from. But without further ado, I think it'd be good for us to go into our first question today. And that is, I'm sure there's lots of people that sort of say, I just don't get anything out of going to Mass. Maybe you could give us some wisdom on that.
Stephen, I cannot claim that by the end of this answer you'll get everything out of going to Mass, but one of the things in the life of the Church that has always interested me greatly is the liturgy. It is the Mass itself and what worship is like and who it is for. So to begin, I would say that people access the Mass on different levels, depending on who they are, what their experience is. So the same Mass has the capacity to speak to somebody who is in a church for the very first time in their life, for somebody who knows the faith but doesn't go very often, and for those who go every single day. So there is something there for everybody, and it all works on different levels. So you should never compare yourself to anybody else and think, oh, look at her, she's getting loads out of this and I'm not getting anything. Try to access it on the level of your own experience and try to work out what your own need is. So I don't get anything out of watching American football. I'm sure I should, and I'm sure there's a perfectly good explanation to the rules of that game, but by watching it, I haven't got a clue. I do not know what it's about or how you score or anything at all. Now, if I went to a game with somebody and they sat there and talked me through it, hopefully by the end of it, I'd be a bit wiser. Can you sit through Mass and talk somebody through it? Actually, we would say you can. We would say that if a new person were going to Mass, we'd want to take them along with an established parishioner just to say, by the way, we kneel down now, we stand now. Oh, that's what's going on, and just help somebody to understand. I've never watched Line of Duty, and I'm watching it for the first time this series. If I hear one more person say to me, oh, well, you can't watch Line of Duty series 6 if you haven't watched 1 to 5. It won't mean anything. Well, I'm holding out at the moment, and I'm listening to the Obsessed with Line of Duty podcast after every episode, hoping that I'll catch up and then get a few tips along the way. I think a lot of times people think it's children and young people who find Mass boring. We've heard that, haven't we? Mass is boring. But if a child or a young person says to their parent, I find Mass boring, and the parent says back to them, so do I, then we're on a sticky wicket, really. So we need to really aim at helping parents to understand the Mass so that they can help their children to understand the Mass. Just another sort of sporting allusion. I have been at sporting events and I've been at concerts where I've been bored. I have never seen somebody on a football field looking bored because they haven't got time. And I haven't seen anyone in an orchestra looking bored or a band on stage looking bored because they haven't got time to be bored. They're involved. They are part of the action, if you like. And that is what we probably need to do more and more with people. Not to give them a job to do. That's a slight misunderstanding of being part of the action, but it is trying to help them deepen their understanding.
So what would you advise then? Someone is about to go to Mass. What would you advise to help them to be involved in the Mass? What can they do? Well,
again, I think it depends what age they are, what their experience of life is, what has drawn them to it in the first place. You know, have they had an experience in their life that has made them say, I want to know more about the faith? I would probably introduce them to somebody whom I think would be a good example of faith to them, somebody who's normal, somebody who can talk them through it, and somebody who's not afraid to answer their questions. Asking questions is absolutely crucial. There was a 9-year-old girl who started coming to Mass in the parish I was in, and she hadn't been baptized and she wanted that, and of course at that age she received Holy Communion as well. And I said to her, look, we're not quite ready to start the first Holy Communion program yet, but I don't want you to stop coming. So come along with your dad as often as you can, every week if you can. And after Mass, every week, I want you to ask me a question. It doesn't matter what it's about. It can be about the colour the priest is wearing. It could be the stained glass windows. It could be why people do things that they do during Mass. Anything at all. Every week, when that girl came to Mass, she came with her dad and she asked me a question. Every time she had a question to ask. And I could tell you that 80% of those questions, I would never have thought to tell her what she was asking. So that shows that the inquiring mind is the way to learn more about the Mass, rather than saying to people, this is what you need to know. Come along, experience it, and ask your questions. I had a teenage altar server once who said, I do try to listen to your homilies on a Sunday, and for the first couple of minutes, you've got me. I can really follow it. But then you seem to turn a corner and I lose it. And I thought to myself, well, that says to me, don't turn that corner. Stay with something in the first 2 minutes that is appealing to people and speaking to them. And if I'm losing you after 2 minutes, it's my problem, not yours. So that was an expression of a teenager who wanted to engage. And it gave me a reason to reflect on my practice.
Well, that is really beautiful, and I love how you're talking there about asking questions. And I think for me, with my own faith, like I grew up as altar serving, and I'm sure you can remember. I can remember meeting you as a little child and sort of looking up and how things have changed. But the whole the whole idea of asking questions is a really powerful one. And I think for me, my faith wouldn't have progressed if I hadn't had that opportunity to ask those questions. So it's certainly something that I would recommend everyone to do, is ask questions. And there is no stupid question. And talking about asking questions, if you would like to ask a question, please stick a question into the comments, and let Father Tim answer that question here and now, and allow everyone to benefit from his answer. That'd be really great. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Father Tim? Or
one of the things that we priests can sometimes get wrong is thinking I'm going to give a very polished homily with learned detail and explain to you the whole Trinity as you've never understood it before. And my experience is that people don't always get a lot out of that. I mean, I know the experience of writing a homily, and as I read through it before Mass, read it out loud, I think to myself, this sounds like an essay. It doesn't sound like I'm talking about faith. It talks like I am writing, and that's not what a homily should be. So somebody said to me recently, and it just made me smile, they said, I was at a Mass with Father X, different priest, and he said, I can honestly say there were more nuggets in his homily than a McDonald's Happy Meal. And it just, nuggets. I want to give you some nuggets here that I have picked up from other people's homilies. And it's just enough to put a light bulb on in your mind and to make you think, I will never listen to that piece of scripture in the same way again. Okay? So the first is, take up your cross and follow me. Jesus said, if anyone wants to be a follower of mine, he must take up his cross and follow me. Does it occur to you that Jesus said that and expected the people to hear it and understand it before Jesus had died on the cross? Because for us, it makes sense to take up your cross because Jesus did. But Jesus was saying this before he did. So what on earth was that supposed to mean to those people? It doesn't mean we don't take up our cross, but it means we know what we're talking about. The second thing is, I got this from Father Patrick Milam, who came to give a homily in the Cathedral. It was the very last Sunday in Lent 2020 before lockdown. It was the third Sunday of Lent, Year A, the Gospel of the Samaritan woman at the well. And he said this. He said, when Jesus says, "Give me a drink," the actual phrase he is using is, "I thirst." And when do we hear that again? On the cross. Now, isn't that amazing to put those two things together? Not just give me a drink, but I thirst. And then we hear I thirst on the cross related to the Psalms. And then the third thing, and this was from Bishop William Kenny recently at the Mass for Altar Servers, the annual diocesan Mass for Altar Servers. And he was talking about the prodigal son, the gospel of the prodigal son. That was the gospel of the day. And he said, we always think about the younger son, the prodigal son. He said, but I think I'd quite like to concentrate on the older brother because I think he's a bit more like us. And he said, of the older brother, he said, when the younger brother comes home and the father's having a feast, he said, the older brother cannot even bring himself to go into the house to meet his younger brother. This was Bishop William's point. He said he didn't even give him the chance to show how he had changed. That knocked me off my feet, that line. He judged him as the son who had gone away. He didn't give him the chance to understand him as he came back, as a model of how we must forgive other people. Those nuggets, Stephen, for me, are things that once you hear something like that, Mass is never boring again. So maybe those of us who are giving out the nuggets need to spend more time in prayer, gaining the nuggets, more time studying to pick up the nuggets, and more time generously giving them to others.
No, that is really, really good advice for me, and really good advice, I'm sure, for everyone listening. We actually have a comment. We have a question from Liam Castle, and he says, do you think live streaming has enabled people to engage more with the Mass?
I think, Liam, thank you. I think that is the jury's out, I would say. I certainly know that it gave people a very different experience of Mass. Housebound people have said they've never had it so good in terms of provision. People who were shielding and couldn't feel able to come to Mass, or couldn't come at times, had the opportunity to be connected in a way that they thought was better than nothing, but it actually turned out to be a lifeline spiritually. I think it's given us a new understanding of what spiritual communion is. For example, I think that those who cannot receive Holy Communion for any number of reasons might now wish to engage more with the idea of spiritual communion. There are people now, sadly, I suppose, who you hear say, you know, I quite like having Mass on in the background while I'm doing the ironing. Now, I understand that, and I certainly get that we've got a job to do to bring people back. But I also want to ask the question, when did the Eucharist, the most precious gift we could ever receive, become, I could take it or leave it? And I don't think people mean that, but I think that's what is actually being said. So has it enabled people to engage more with the Mass? There were a lot, every priest will have his stories about things he got wrong or things that he could have done better. Somebody again said to me, I particularly enjoyed it when you moved that stand from point A to point B on the sanctuary and you didn't switch your microphone on and you sounded like an asthmatic pushing a piano up a hill. So people didn't miss much in my experience. They were looking at things in a new way. Again, people went to Walsingham, to Rome, to Chicago. That's fantastic. The one danger that you get with live streaming, as you do if you go from one church to another looking for the perfect church that doesn't exist, is that you can end up giving Mass or its participants marks out of 10 rather than sticking with the same one, going through whatever pain barrier there is of committing to one place and learning to love it with its inadequacies. So I think it has helped people to look at things in a new way. But I would hate for us to think because it's given people a new insight, it will do. I think we really got to work hard, not just to wait and see who comes back, but to go out and bring them back.
That is wonderful, Father, and it's and I think it's exciting that we have this opportunity now of a fresh perspective of the Mass as we go forward, and I think lots of people that have maybe been away from the Mass for years had just sort of seen it come on their news feed, and I'll always remember being an admin and someone turning around and saying, I haven't been to Mass since I was at school, and I just realised what I'd missed. And I think that has been an interesting way to see that as well. So, and it's about inviting those people into our churches and allowing them to feel that welcome, you know.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about that, Stephen, is that I think everybody who has done live streaming could say, regardless of numbers, I think they could say, I have more people attending Mass, whatever that means to them and for how long they attend. The statistics show I will have always, every single day, had more people online for Mass than I have in real life before the pandemic. There must be a question to ask about why that is, maybe what it is that prevents people crossing the threshold of the church. Do we seem too threatening to them? Do they feel that they don't want to tell us their whole life story when they come to Mass? Do they feel judged by coming to Mass? But more people are joining in live stream than actual people coming to Mass, in my experience. And I believe others have said the same.
Can I just quickly ask, and I think it's an important question, maybe someone's watching now and they say, I've been sitting there watching it on the live stream, I've maybe been away for years or never been into a Catholic church in my life. What do I do, and what encouragement would you give me to cross that threshold?
I think the word welcome just is the beginning and the end. People are welcome. And the more that we overcome the barriers that say church is for all those who want to look good on a Sunday and church is all for those who think they're better than everybody else. We've heard all those lines. I resolutely reject those lines on the grounds that the people I know who come to Mass on a Sunday are people who know their need for God. They come because they know God's place in their life. They probably had a hard week and they want to come and pray about it, or they've had a great week and they want to come and thank God for it. So if there's anything at all that somebody feels they want to come, there is nothing at all stopping you. And even, well, when I say there's nothing stopping you, I cannot speak for the person who tuts at a child who is crying. They don't tut on my behalf, I can assure you, but I can't stop them doing it either. I can, from time to time, say, we could have a really lovely quiet service here because we're almost dying on our feet. Or we can hear the cries of children who are showing there's new life in the church. I know what I'd rather say. I quite like the line, there's a chapel over there for children who are crying. If you don't like children crying, perhaps you would like to go and sit in that chapel over there. You know, more and more saying to people, if there's, never underestimate how much you can put somebody off. You know, for a young parent to be made to feel unwelcome, why would they come back? To be judged when they've actually gone through whatever they've gone through to get there that Sunday. Just welcome them. just make them feel welcome.
Absolutely, absolutely. I would completely agree with that. And the for me, that's our our most important job at a weekend is to look around us if we are regular mass goers and to sort of turn around and go, I've never seen that person before. Just go, introduce yourself, and say, socially distanced at the moment, but but just to say, like, you know, I just want to say you're very welcome. And I think even just to be able to say that, that allows people to have that sense that they're welcome here and that people want that. But we're gonna.
I would
So,
much rather be accused of saying, how dare you say welcome, I've been coming here for 20 years and I've never seen you either, than be on the receiving end of somebody saying, I came to Mass for months and nobody ever spoke to me. I was off for weeks and ill and nobody missed me. There's something very nice about being missed and being noticed. And if somebody doesn't want to be noticed, that's fine. But I think just to say, better to be told, I don't need welcoming, thank you, than not to be welcomed.
absolutely. We're going to move on now to our next question. But if you've got a question for Father Tim, if there's something there that has really struck you or comment, please drop it into the comments and we'll be able to bring it up to have a little discussion about it. But we're going to move on to our next topic for today, and it's quite a big topic. So we'll bring that up, and it's the question is, what does God think about suicide?
Well, I asked myself whether I can presume to speak on God's behalf. And then I thought, well, I presume to speak on God's behalf about reconciliation quite a lot. So why not in this situation? I listened to a talk recently by a permanent deacon in the United States whose own son had died by suicide. And he said, there are times when I can talk about this and it's another day of my life. And there are times when I talk about this and I can't get through a sentence. He said, but can I please just ask one thing? And that is, could we say somebody has died by suicide rather than somebody has committed suicide? He said, even that phrase, committed suicide, has a feel of blame about it, whereas a much more enlightened view would say we could not imagine what is going through the mind of somebody who feels they cannot live and they cannot speak to anybody about it. So traditionally, the church would have had a view on suicide which followed the logic that if life is a gift that only God can give and only God can take away, then by taking the life either of another person or your own life was going against the law of God. I mean, that is the logic of it. And if you take somebody else's life, then generally you are punished in some way. You go to prison, you know, whatever the reasons. But it's interesting, I think, to think about when somebody takes another person's life and it is said to be through diminished responsibility. Now, if I were to kill somebody tomorrow and I had an illness of the mind that had led me to do that, then that family would have been robbed of a member of their family. I would have done it without intent. And so there are no winners. But you would have more compassion for me than if I had lay in wait for somebody as a premeditated murder. So I think that diminished responsibility and idea is one that can help us, because we're not then judging somebody for what they've done. We cannot begin to imagine what is going through somebody's mind. But I think it is important to address this, because Catholics would have known a time where somebody who had died by suicide could not have a funeral in church, could not be buried in consecrated ground. And you'll still hear Catholics asking that question now, because it's right there in their mind about the church having a problem with suicide. I think what I would say to that is we understand better now that this person, yes, they have taken a life that was not theirs to take, but we proclaim the mercy of God in all circumstances. Nobody is beyond the mercy of God in life. How can we say they are in death? And for the family of somebody who has died by suicide, there are always more questions left than answers. They live with that for the rest of their life. Whatever has happened, they don't get to that stage of, in this life, finding out the answers. And maybe if I could just put it alongside another thing I picked up recently at a workshop I attended on misogyny and sexism. How often do we hear the statistics of those women who have been raped in any given year or city or country? And we don't hear the statistic of the number of men who have raped women. We're talking about two very, very sensitive subjects here. But I believe that talking about dying by suicide rather than committing suicide, and men raping women, as is most often the case, rather than women being raped, it points to something that just changes our mindset, and I think in a helpful way.
So what would you say to family members, like as a priest, that have lost loved ones who have died by suicide?
I think the question is, what do you say to somebody who has had a bereavement in any circumstances? I think you begin with a sense of loss. You begin with a sense of the life of a person. Very interesting how often somebody who has died by suicide, everybody they know wants to tell a story about how they were the life and soul of the party. They always had a smile on their face. They always made other people laugh. Now, I don't mean that always happens. Some people have a very sad life that leads to suicide. But this is people's reality. It may be that somebody who has been the life and soul of the party, always made everybody laugh, then dies by suicide. The questions remain. And probably, a little bit like earlier when we said the inquiring mind is the best way to grow in faith. I think one of the best answers to the question of why did this happen, whether it is somebody dying by suicide or anything else in the life of faith, the answer, I don't know, is a really good one, because claiming to know the answer to questions that have no answers is really not very helpful.
What would you say about the mercy of God? And I think we have this idea that of God, particularly within our society, that he's sort of looking down and ready to beat us with a stick all of the time. What would you say about that if someone has that image of God that is judgmental? You hear the word Catholic guilt or those type of expressions. Maybe you could speak into that.
Yeah, you would always want to put people off feeling guilty. Guilt doesn't achieve a whole lot. Conscience, on the other hand, and I don't want to drift into other areas of your series, Stephen, but a conscience can be a good thing. If I don't want people to feel guilty for the sake of it, or to make them feel bad or beat themselves up. But if the alternative to Catholic guilt is never to feel guilty about anything and never to reflect on anything because you can't be wrong, there are times when I think I'd take Catholic guilt. When we're talking in the context of suicide, I think I want to be quite clear on this, that I want to talk about the compassion of God, because the mercy of God is always connected with sin and forgiveness. Now, I've already explained how the logic of it is that if somebody takes a life, whether their own or somebody else's, it's a gift that was only God's to take. I would want to talk a lot more about the compassion of God in the context of suicide, because the compassion is as much for the people who are left behind as the person who has died. You almost don't want to feel sorry anymore for the person who's died. You know, whatever it was that was troubling them to such an extent that there must be some level of relief on the part of their family. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that this has not come close to my own door. I have known people in this situation, but I'm not speaking from deep personal experience. And, you know, if I say that people feel relieved that that person is beyond their sufferings, I'm sure somebody's going to say to me, how dare you say that? I'd want them here, whatever their sufferings were. But I think when you see somebody who is so tormented in life, and sometimes you see somebody and you think it doesn't matter what level of intervention, what level of care, there is a lack of peace in this person's life that seems never to come good. I would just want to focus on the compassion of God for that person who is now beyond the struggle, but much more for the family for whom the questions remain. And I think, you know, we talk about the judgment of God. We always should add the merciful judgment of God for anybody. And so when somebody has died, they are beyond the struggle. And rather than giving an account of themselves, which always feels like it could be a tick box or a checking up, there's a lovely image of being able to tell the story of your life with clarity of mind in a way that you couldn't while you were alive. And to do that, I think is very comforting.
What would you say then? Like, you were talking about the compassion there, and I know from my study of scripture, when Jesus says compassion, he's saying suffer with, that he's suffering with. Maybe you could sort of talk about the power of Jesus sort of suffering with us and how we can enter in those times of when things seem so bad, and things like, particularly in this pandemic, we've seen lots of suffering, lots of pain. How people can really enter into suffering, but like not because God wants to give us suffering, but because naturally it's part of our life. Maybe you could talk about that, maybe just quickly.
I'm not one to play scripture bingo, but Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 7 is a particular favourite of mine. And it's one that we hear on Good Friday, the second reading on Good Friday. During his life on earth, Christ offered up prayer and entreaty, aloud and in silent tears. I think that is such a beautiful but also reassuring image, aloud and in silent tears. It means that the person who is at their very lowest ebb is never on their own. And one of the mistakes I suppose we make with prayer or asking things of Christ is that here's my problem, sort it out. Actually, our faith is in the incarnation, God becoming one of us. And so it's not about solving the problems, it's about understanding our problems and sharing our human condition. In any set of circumstances, if somebody has an illness, they will identify more with that person who has the illness than anybody who can talk about it or reason it through. You know, the whole basis of Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, is people who have had the experience and who know how it feels and can to use the language of faith, minister to each other. So Christ suffered, Christ was abandoned. We tussle with that whole concept of the Father abandoned the Son, but that is our belief. The Son was not abandoned a little bit, he was abandoned. And he was, he descended into hell. So I think we have that Christ who identifies with us. Christ who knew abandonment, knew loneliness, knew rejection, knew betrayal. So many of those things that are the hardest things for us to cope with in life. And knowing that Christ went through them is something very precious for us.
No, fantastic. And we've got a question here from Sue Nightingale, who says, do you believe God forgives those who felt that they should have done more to prevent suicide?
As I said earlier, I cannot sort of put into words how difficult it must be to be somebody who is left behind, and the questions that are asked, and the could I not have done more? Should I have noticed? And like I said before, the times where people say somebody went out to work with a smile on their face in the morning and were found in the evening and there was nothing you could have done. There was no way you would have known. I don't imagine that God looks at any one of us in those circumstances and says, you should have done more. I think quite often I have the conversation with people after somebody has died, where somebody has been in a caring role, or somebody has been visiting, or somebody has been, doing their best, whether they've done it well or they haven't done it well, just to say to them, can you answer the question, I did what I could. I couldn't have done any more. And sometimes people say, well, I could have done more. And I look at them and I say, no, you couldn't have done more. You say that because it's the thing to say. But actually, I don't believe you could have done more. And I think there is real consolation in saying that, to say, I've done my best. And probably death by suicide is a good example of how much grief and bereavement tends to point towards always focusing on our last memories of somebody. I think there is such a lot to be said for remembering somebody's whole life than remembering their illness and or their death. That is not the person's whole life in God's eyes. It shouldn't be their whole life in our eyes. And usually, when somebody has died by suicide, you must look for the positives in their life. You must look back at a time when they were happy. And, even if that turned a corner and changed, there must be times and they must be a source of consolation.
No, very powerful words there. And Jonathan Bowes also says very powerful words. So it's great to have you watching, Jonathan. Thank you so much for covering that subject. And I know that it would have meant a lot to a lot of people to hear that and to hear those words. We have another question here, and I think it goes back to our first topic. So we'll just quickly revert back quickly to just have a look at this. It says, when will divorced people be acknowledged in the church? Just because you're divorced doesn't mean you can't go to church or receive the sacraments. Maybe you would like to comment on that, Phil.
Okay, Denise, I suppose this is a big topic and it's probably one that we haven't quite got time for tonight, but there is a technicality, and I hope using the word technicality doesn't seem too clinical. There is a big misunderstanding in the church that divorce puts you outside the sacraments. Divorce does not put you outside the sacraments. The end of a marriage in civil terms does not affect your standing in the church. That's probably one of the saddest things, where people feel that it does. and therefore they leave the church and you can't reach them. The point at which somebody makes a choice to marry again is the point at which the reception of sacraments is in question. And again, it's a big area. I think anybody in priestly ministry will know that generalizations are not helpful. You know, when people say, well, what about if I got divorced because something was done to me or happened to me? So I think it's really important to say divorce in and of itself is not something that the church makes a judgment on. It is only when somebody marries again and their first marriage is still valid that that issue arises. And again, I'm very sensitive to the fact that this is something that is very painful for people, whether people involved, people who feel like they're on the receiving end, people who feel that their first marriage was bad in a way that was not their fault. And that is where the whole process of nullity of marriage comes in, if it can be shown that something was not right with the marriage before it started. So when will the church open up the sacraments and welcome to divorced people? If it is divorce that you're talking about, the church does not make any judgment about that at all. Popular misconception among Catholics. In terms of returning to the sacraments in other situations, I think I would have to say the needs and circumstances of individuals would need to be listened to.
Wonderful. No, thank you so much for covering that. It's really great to get questions from the audience. So if you've got a question for Father Tim, I encourage you to pop it into the comments before the end of the show, and we'll be able to get those questions answered. But we'll move to our next question now, which is, can't you be a good person without being a Christian?
Well, go on.
No, carry on.
You can be a good person without being a Christian. I think that at the most basic level, God saw all that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So everything created by God, people, and all in creation, as Pope Francis would remind us on a daily basis in Laudato Si, praise be to you, Lord, for all creation. Everything that God has made is good. To be a good person, you don't need to be a Christian. We could first of all cite people of other faith traditions. And one of the things that the church hasn't always been good at is learning from what is good in other faith traditions, because there have been times where we've almost seen other faiths as the opposition rather than people of goodness who seek God in their own lives. But I think probably what we need to address here is there is more to being a Christian than being a good person. To be a good person, you love people and you don't hate them. You go out of your way to give to charity, all sorts of things that good people do. What makes a Christian is that they are Christ-like. So when somebody says, for example, in a Catholic school, well, we have an ethos. Well, I would say, well, doesn't every school have an ethos? So it's not a question of having an ethos. Everyone's got an ethos. Everyone's got beliefs in something, even people who say they're an atheist. I can't imagine somebody says, I don't believe in anything. So a good person who is a Christian person lives their life modeled on Jesus Christ. Now, I think it would be a slightly shallow understanding of the 3 years of Christ's ministry to say he just went around being a good person all the time. He challenged people, he questioned people, he called people out sometimes, ask the Pharisees, ask the Sadducees. He wasn't going around being nice to people all the time. He was doing the Father's will. He was transforming the world. He was trying to show people a better way of living. Now, isn't that a trap for Christians, showing people a better way of living? If you get too far up there on the moral high ground, there's only one way to go. You come tumbling down. And that's how Christians have fallen foul, because we set moral codes and we don't always live by them. So to be a Christian is not different from being a good person, but I think it's when you have knowledge of something, then you are expected to employ that knowledge in the way you live. If somebody has never heard of the Bible before, reference tomorrow, Acts of the Apostles at Mass, then they need somebody to explain it. It's almost going full circle to how Mass can't be boring. But if you have never heard it before, you can't be expected to live by it. If you have heard it, then there is a higher expectation. So people, you think about the number of people today who have not been baptized. So again, on a technicality, they're not Christian. We wouldn't say that they don't act in a Christian way. We don't say that they don't consider themselves to be Christian. But if a definition of Christian is baptism, then there are lots of people who are good Christians in their way of living without being baptized. It could be slightly insulting to say to a Muslim, you know, you're just like a good Christian. And they might say, well, actually, I've got a code of my own, thank you. So to live a Christian life, think about these lines of Jesus. What did he want Christians to be? Go out to the whole world, proclaim the good news. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You will work miracles in my name. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That is the hallmark of a Christian, being like Christ. And some of that is being a good person.
So maybe people are asking, then what makes a Christian, in the sense, different? How do we, what is our moral code? So we know it's to go out and to love one another. But is there a code that we can follow? Is there something that we can look to that helps us to live that code out in our own lives?
We have the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are a code for living. Now, I have an uncle in America, and he came to visit once, and he said, can I ask you a question? He said, why don't more priests and deacons preach on the Ten Commandments? Why don't they actually preach on the Ten Commandments more often? He said, I can't remember a last time I heard a homily on the Ten Commandments or a talk of any kind. And I sat and pondered it for several seconds. And I said, I imagine probably we avoid it because we don't want people to feel bad, because most people probably aren't keeping the Ten Commandments as a whole. And he said, I understand that. I know that. He said, don't you think it would be helpful to preach on it and to help people live it, rather than ignore the Ten Commandments and leave people at sea in how to keep them? Now, again, I've said before, the preacher can be hindered from preaching living a good life if he doesn't feel worthy to do it himself. But the preacher is not expected to feel worthy. He's expected to proclaim the truth. And, you know, sometimes, as it is said, preach to himself as well as the congregation. So why don't we preach more? Soon after that, I gave a talk at a faith gathering, and my chosen specialist subject was the Ten Commandments, because my uncle told me to.
It's always good to do what your uncle tells you to do. So, and what would you say about virtues? Maybe you could talk a little bit about, like we hear in Christian life, live a virtuous life. What is a virtue, and how do we live that out within the Christian context?
Gosh, you don't ask small questions, do you, Steve? Well, let's start with faith, hope, and love. If you say, what is the mark of a Christian? Faith, hope, and love. And, who am I to argue with St. Paul? And the greatest of these is love. But in the world of today, what about sticking to hope? How many people despair? How many people genuinely believe there is nothing after this life? I think I would despair if I didn't think there was anything after this life. How many people hold on to life because they're afraid to let it go? Okay, it's all that we know in one sense. But people sort of say, our life doesn't end here. Our life is only just beginning when the earthly part finishes. So faith, hope, and love. What is it to have faith? It's not to have all the answers. It's to have a place to ask the questions, to give people hope when they are lacking it is an amazing gift. And you can only do it if you've got hope in your own heart. And hope in your own heart comes through answers to prayer. And that's not always easy to quantify or articulate either. And love, a world in which I am keener to point out what I don't agree with you on rather than what I do agree with you on, is a world that is lacking in love. And if Christians are supposed to transform the world after the person of Jesus Christ, faith, hope, and love is a pretty good ABC starter for me.
Wonderful, wonderful. And if I can just take this opportunity to thank you before we go to our final sort of reflection for this evening. But it's been a pleasure to have you on the show today. And it's been a pleasure to have all you watching. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for all of the questions and comments. It's been really a great show. But would you be able to end the show maybe with a reflection or a prayer for us, Father Tim?
I will. Stephen, just before I do that, I'm sure those who follow you online will know that you've announced this week that you're going to be ordained a deacon on the 6th of June. And that's a cause for great joy. I've known you, as you say, for very many years. And it's been a long journey. But I'm sure everyone who's watching at any time this broadcast will want to assure you of their prayers. A remembrance at Mass. Mass never boring because we take people to prayer there, and we shall keep you in our prayers in the weeks to come.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to finish with some lines from Cardinal Basil Hume, who was a bit of a hero of mine. He died in 1999, just before the turn of the millennium. But he said this, and I think that it probably speaks to us of the life of faith in its very broadest sense. There is something in the human experience of desiring, of beauty, and of truth that points beyond itself, that transcends the limitations of our understanding and aspirations. To acknowledge this transcendence is to recognize at the heart of our experience of the world and of ourselves lies a mystery. In fact, to speak of God is to encounter a mystery. A mystery is a reality that we can never fully understand, nor even indeed discover for ourselves. We think of mysteries as problems that can be analysed and resolved. But this mystery can never be solved. It can only be entered and explored by one who accepts with awe and reverence that the deepest reality is unimaginably greater than we can ever comprehend, that beyond the limitations of our senses and even the horizon of death lies a place of inexpressible joy, the fountain of all life and love.
There we are, powerful words. And thank you so much for that, Father Tim. And it's been a wonderful show. And thank you so much. And we will see you next week, and at the same time at 7:30. And take care, and God bless. There you go.